Lena Carter had never seen a storm swallow a city the way it swallowed Manhattan that night. Rain hammered the glass walls of the high-rise towers like 1,000 frantic fists, and thunder rolled low and angry across the skyline. The streetlights blurred into ribbons of gold as taxis splashed through deep puddles, their reflections flickering across Lena's soaked sneakers, while she stood in front of the building that should never have had her name anywhere near it. She clutched the strap of her worn canvas bag, the only thing she had grabbed when the hospital called to say her sister's heart had stalled, and they were doing everything they could. Everything they could still required money. Money she did not have. Money she had run out of months ago. Money that a stranger in the hospital hallway had whispered about when he recognized her sister's name on the file. Emily Carter once worked for a billionaire who still owed her more than he ever realized. That stranger pointed her to an appointment in a penthouse overlooking Central Park, an appointment her sister had meant to attend that night, but never made it to because her heart had collapsed on the floor of the ICU. Now Lena stood dripping on marble floors, so polished they mirrored skyscrapers. The lobby guard scanned her suspiciously before confirming her name through an intercom. A moment later, he gestured her toward the private elevator that rose without a single shutter to the 50th floor. A soft chime announced her arrival at the corridor leading to Ethan Blackwell's penthouse. Her stomach twisted so hard she had to steady herself against the wall before she knocked. When the tall double doors opened, she froze. Ethan Blackwell looked nothing like the stiff corporate portraits she found on Google Images. In person, he was sharper, colder, more painfully handsome. His dark hair was swept back in a way that made the silver strands near his temples stand out. His shoulders filled the doorway, and his presence filled the hallway with a quiet, dangerous stillness. He looked like a man who carried grief the way others carried breath. Not something he chose, but something he lived with. His voice was deep, rougher than she expected when he said, "I was told someone would be arriving. You are not her." Lena's throat tightened. Her fingers trembled at her sides. She felt like a trespasser in a world built from glass and steel and the kind of money that made people untouchable. She forced herself to speak, though her voice shook. "My sister collapsed at the hospital, so I came instead tonight." Ethan's expression did not change at first. It was the kind of stillness that felt like judgment. Then his eyes narrowed in confusion. "Your sister, Emily Carter." He said the name carefully as if tasting something sharp. That was the moment he looked at Lena as if seeing her clearly for the first time. The resemblance to Emily, the soft eyes, the stubborn jaw, the quiet fire. He stepped back and motioned for her to enter. She hesitated before walking into a living room bigger than the entire floor of the apartment she shared with her sister. Floor-to-ceiling glass revealed the storm ripping across Central Park in silver streaks and brutal wind. Ethan crossed his arms. Why did she not come herself? Lena's breath caught. She did not want to break in front of this man, but her voice cracked anyway. She collapsed. Heart failure. The doctors are trying. They need approval for a transplant match. They need money for the tests. They said without it, they cannot proceed. Her chest tightened until she felt she might shatter. She wiped the back of her hand against her wet cheek, but tears kept spilling anyway. "I thought she was coming here tonight. I found the appointment email. I had no one else to turn to. I did not know what this meeting was for. but I came because I have no other choice." Ethan stared at her with a stillness so sharp it felt like the room tilted. He had expected a negotiation, a transaction, someone polished, confident, strategic. Not a trembling young woman soaked in rain asking for the impossible with raw desperation in her voice. He asked softly, "Do you know what your sister was coming here for?" Lena shook her head. "No, I just need to save her. I will do anything." The silence stretched. Ethan looked at her the way a man looks at a truth he did not ask to face. Then he spoke with a voice low and controlled. "I can cover everything, the tests, the surgery, the recovery. But I need something in return." Her heart slammed painfully. "What?" He exhaled slowly, as if deciding something dangerous. "Stay with me for a week. Be here when I need companionship. Let me not be alone." Lena's breath faltered. A week with him. In this world she did not belong in. A week in exchange for her sister's life. Her mind screamed no, but her heart whispered Emily. She closed her eyes for one slow, trembling second. When she opened them, she nodded. "Yes, I agree." Ethan looked at her as if something inside him shifted too deep to name. That night, neither of them knew they had just signed a contract with fate. Lena had imagined wealth before, from storefront televisions and glossy magazines, but nothing prepared her for the quiet excess of Ethan Blackwell's world, where nothing glittered loudly, and yet everything whispered money in the soft glide of the floors, the muted art on the walls, the scent of polished wood, and something clean and expensive in the air. Within an hour of her agreement, a woman appeared like an apparition, elegant, calm, efficient, and placed a silk dress in Lena's trembling hands. The fabric was cool and impossibly soft, and it slipped over her thin body like water hiding the cheap cotton shirt and jeans she had worn in from the rain. When the woman stepped back, Lena barely recognized herself in the mirror. She looked like a stranger, someone who belonged in this penthouse, someone who had choices. Downstairs, a quiet chauffeur waited beside a black Maybach that moved through the city as if the storm had parted only for it. From the back seat, Lena watched neon signs blur by, in colors she rarely allowed herself to admire in her real life, where every dollar had a destination before she ever earned it. Dinner was prepared before they returned. A long table set with candles flickering softly in the stormlight outside. The food looked like artwork, and she was painfully aware of how hungrily she ate at first, until she slowed under Ethan's unreadable gaze. He barely touched his plate at all. He watched her instead with a look that was neither desire nor judgment, but something closer to curiosity edged with restraint. When she lifted her eyes, she met his, and quickly looked away, heat flooding her face. She had never sat across from a man like this before, a man whose silence carried weight. After dinner, he showed her the guest bedroom, though the word guest felt like a kindness she did not fully deserve. The room held white sheets untouched and a window that framed the city like a living painting. She stood at the edge of the bed, unsure where to place her hands, unsure where she belonged. Ethan hesitated at the doorway, then spoke softly. "You can stay here tonight. Nothing will happen unless you say so." Relief rushed through her so powerfully, her knees nearly gave out. "Thank you," she whispered. That night she lay awake, listening to the rain against the glass, unable to rest because her sister was fighting for breath across the city, and because Ethan Blackwell existed in the room across the hallway like a quiet storm of his own. The following evening she wore the silk dress again, for him unsure why it mattered, but feeling seen in a way she never had before. Their second dinner passed in soft conversation, where she spoke of nursing school, of night shifts, of caring for Emily since their parents had died. He spoke little of himself, only that he worked too much and slept too little, and that insomnia was his closest companion. Later, when thunder shook the windows, he joined her in the living room, without a word, sitting at the opposite end of the couch, like a man unsure how close he was allowed to stand. The silence between them stretched with something unspoken until she finally murmured, "You do not have to sit so far away." He moved closer, just enough for her to feel his warmth. When his hand brushed hers, she startled, and his hand retreated instantly. "I am sorry," he said. She shook her head. "No, it is all right." The world outside seemed to fade until only the sound of rain remained. They eventually rose together, moving toward the bedroom, not with urgency, but with careful steps, as though each one was crossing invisible lines they could not redraw. In the soft glow of the lamp, he reached for her cheek, then paused, waiting. She nodded. The kiss that followed was hesitant, unsure tasting of rain and something fragile. Her hands trembled against his chest, and he broke away, almost immediately breathing hard. "We should stop," he said, roughness creeping into his voice. She nodded again, though disappointment flickered through her. They lay beside each other, fully clothed, the space between them charged and unbearable. She shook with nerves, and he noticed pulling the blanket over her shoulders gently. They did not sleep together that first night, not in the way the world would define it, but her body learned the shape of his presence, and her heart learned the dangerous rhythm of wanting. In the days that followed, she learned his routines, the quiet mornings when he drank black coffee, in near silence, the long phone calls that left him looking distant, the rare moments when a ghost of a smile curved his mouth as she cooked simple meals for him and filled the spaces in his schedule with something softer. She discovered he hated the color red in his workspace and that he listened to classical music when he could not sleep. He discovered that she hummed unconsciously while washing dishes, and that she flinched at sudden loud noises born from nights in hospital waiting rooms. He watched the way she folded herself inward when she felt small in his world, and felt something twist painfully in his chest at the sight. That week had not passed yet, but something subtle had already begun to shift. The contract between them had started as a transaction, but desire did not feel like negotiation, and loneliness did not obey rules. The days that followed unfolded with a strange intimacy that neither of them had planned, yet neither could escape. Lena woke before dawn out of habit and padded quietly through the penthouse to the kitchen where she brewed coffee. She barely dared to drink herself, and Ethan would find her there, standing barefoot at the counter, staring at the city as if it were another patient she could not save. And without speaking, he would take the mug from her hands and pour a little milk into it because he had noticed she drank it bitter only when she was anxious, and that tiny attention did something dangerous to her heart. At night, when insomnia dragged him back to the living room, she would sit beside him on the couch and read softly from a book she barely remembered the title of, just so he could close his eyes and listen to a human voice, not asking anything of him. And sometimes he did sleep, and when he woke, he would find her curled carefully at the other end of the couch, like she was afraid to take up too much space in his world. One afternoon, a private doctor arrived to update them on Emily's condition, and he spoke directly to Lena with that gentle concern professionals reserved for those who were suffering openly. And Ethan watched from the doorway as the man placed a steadying hand on her shoulder and felt something sharp, unexpected, and unwelcome rise in his chest, a possessive heat that startled him because he had no right to it, and yet his body responded before his conscience could catch up. Later that evening, he questioned her about the appointment in a tone he tried to keep neutral, and she answered with sincere gratitude for his support, completely unaware of the storm he was fighting inside. And for the first time since his wife had died, he realized that desire had returned, not loud, not reckless, but slow and deliberate and frightening in its restraint. Another night he passed her in the hallway, and their shoulders brushed, and he stopped walking entirely. Because the simple contact felt too powerful, and without thinking, he caught her wrist as she moved past him, his fingers closing gently but firmly around her skin, and the shock in her eyes made him release her at once, with an apology that sounded almost like a confession, and she fled to her room shaking with an emotion she could not untangle because fear and wondering lived too close together in her chest. He stood alone in the hallway, staring at the place where she had been, and whispered to himself that he had made a mistake agreeing to this arrangement, because desire did not stay in its assigned corner, and loneliness was not content with boundaries. The next day she cooked him soup the way she used to for Emily, on nights when hospital meals were too sterile to bring comfort, and when he tasted it, something in him softened at the simple act of care that had nothing to do with contracts or obligation. And when she smiled shyly at his approval, he realized with quiet dread that he wanted to be worthy of that smile, and did not know how. The tension between them grew in the spaces where words failed them, in the way his gaze lingered too long, and in the way she avoided his eyes, only to look back when she thought he was not watching, and when she laughed at something trivial, he felt the sound settle into his bones like it belonged there. One evening, as rain returned to the windows and thunder rolled through the city, she sat beside him again on the couch and spoke softly about her childhood, about nights spent listening to her parents argue over medical bills, and mornings when she and Emily shared a single piece of toast before school, and without warning, tears slipped down her cheeks, because speaking the truth aloud made it real in a way silence had not. And Ethan lifted his hand almost instinctively before stopping short, unsure if he was allowed to touch that grief. And when she leaned into him without words, he finally let his arm come around her shoulders slowly, as if she might break at the slightest pressure. They stayed like that for a long time, her head resting against his chest, his heartbeat loud in her ear, and her quiet breathing steadying him in return. And he knew in that stillness that he was no longer fighting attraction alone, but the impossible desire to protect her, not because of any promise made, but because the instinct had buried itself too deeply in him to dislodge. Later that night, when she stood at the threshold of her room, she turned back and looked at him with a vulnerability that cut straight through his control, and said, "Thank you for today." And the ache in his chest answered before he could, and when the door closed between them, he remained in the hallway for several minutes, struggling with the truth that he wanted her not only in his bed, but in the hidden places of himself he had sealed shut for years. He admitted it at last in the darkness, where even he could not lie to himself, that he no longer desired only the comfort of her presence, but the future it hinted at and the danger it carried. And with that admission came the quiet, terrifying understanding that he was already losing the distance he needed to keep them both safe. The call came just before dawn, when the city was holding its breath between night and morning, and Lena was half awake from another dream that had left her heart racing. The vibration of her phone on the nightstand felt louder than thunder, and she answered with shaking fingers, already knowing the sound in the nurse's voice before the words confirmed it. Emily's condition had worsened overnight. Her heart was failing faster than expected, and the transplant team needed immediate authorization to proceed with an emergency match. Lena was dressed and at the door before the call even ended. Panic flooding her veins so violently she could barely breathe. Ethan appeared in the hallway the moment she stepped out his room, drawn to movement as if instinct had dragged him there. And when he saw her face, he did not ask questions, because he already knew the answer lived in her eyes. They rode to the hospital in silence, while rain chased the windshield and the city blurred into colorless streaks. And Lena pressed her hands together in her lap, not in prayer because she no longer trusted hope, but in a desperate effort to keep herself from breaking apart. Inside the ICU, the beeping of machines felt like a cruel heartbeat. Counting down the seconds of her sister's life, Emily lay pale beneath white sheets, her chest rising unevenly. Her lips faintly blue as if winter had already reached inside her. Lena dropped to her knees beside the bed, unable to hold herself upright any longer. Her fingers trembling as she brushed a loose strand of hair from her sister's forehead and whispered that she was here now, that everything would be all right. Even as terror hollowed her chest, the doctors spoke in measured tones about donor lists and compatibility windows and the urgent need for financial clearance before any further preparation could continue. And Lena lifted her head with wild desperation, searching their faces for mercy. She knew they did not carry. Then Ethan stepped forward and spoke her sister's name with quiet authority. "Emily Carter will receive whatever she needs without delay," he said. And when the administrator hesitated, he added the weight of his identity. "Without anger, only certainty. I take full responsibility." The machinery of medicine shifted instantly after that, with signatures exchanged at rapid speed and phone calls placed to specialized units. And Lena watched in stunned silence as the impossible began to look like something almost reachable. She followed as they wheeled Emily away for further scans. Her hands pressed tight to her mouth, as if to keep her heart from tearing free. And when she turned back, she found Ethan standing behind her, steady and unflinching in the center of the storm. She was drowning in. She did not realize she had leaned into him until his arms closed around her and held her upright when her legs gave out, and she cried then with the full weight of years she had spent, pretending she was strong enough to carry everything alone. Hours passed in fragments of sound and sterile light and whispered conversations, and in that suspended world, Lena became suddenly aware of the bargain she had made, of the fact that Emily's life now rested on money that did not belong to them, and on a man whose world she had only begun to glimpse. The fear of that realization crept into her chest beside the relief and tangled itself with a new emotion she did not dare name. Yet she watched Ethan confer with the doctor's his jaw set with determination that surprised her and stirred something warm and dangerous in her heart. He moved with confidence inside the hospital corridors, as if he belonged everywhere and nowhere at once. And yet when he looked back at her, she saw something unguarded in his eyes that made her pulse stumble. At one point, a nurse offered her coffee, and she realized her hands were still shaking as she wrapped them around the cup, and Ethan's fingers brushed hers briefly as he steadied the saucer beneath it. A simple gesture that grounded her more than anything else that night. She whispered thank you without lifting her eyes, and he answered with a quiet nod. The unspoken understanding between them thickening in the air. They waited together through the scan results and the frantic coordination of transplant teams across state lines. And finally a surgeon approached them with cautious hope in his voice to say that a compatible donor had been found and preparations would move forward immediately if the final authorization was secured. Ethan signed without pause, his name a swift, decisive mark on each page that represented millions reduced to ink and intention. And in that moment, Lena saw the full measure of the sacrifice he was making, not in money alone, but in the irrevocable crossing of a boundary between their worlds. When Emily was taken into surgery, Lena pressed her forehead to the cold glass of the observation window, unable to look away. From the bright chaos inside and the waiting that followed became a slow, unbearable stretch of time that bent around her breath and the raw beat of her heart. She sat beside Ethan in a pale corridor where whispered footsteps passed like ghosts and spoke nothing of what they feared. Because to name it would have made it real, he did not try to distract her or offer platitudes. He simply stayed with her presence, a steady force that kept her from shattering completely. And in the long hours before dawn, she found her head resting against his shoulder without knowing how it had gotten there. Her tears dampening the expensive fabric of his jacket, as if it belonged to her and not to wealth. When at last the surgeon returned with exhaustion in his eyes and relief in his voice to say the transplant had succeeded, Lena felt the world tilt beneath her in a rush of light, so overwhelming she nearly collapsed again. Her sob broke free without restraint this time as she covered her face with both hands and cried with the violent gratitude of someone who had been standing at the edge of an abyss, and stepped back at the final moment Ethan held her. Then, without hesitation, his arms firm and protective, as if the decision had already been made inside him that this was where he belonged in the aftermath of crisis and terror. And as they stood there together in the humming, sterile corridor, something quiet and irrevocable settled between them. Later, when Emily lay sleeping in recovery with color returning slowly to her cheeks, Lena stood beside the bed watching the steady rise and fall of her chest and felt the delayed weight of everything that had happened rush through her in dizzying waves. She realized with sudden clarity that her sister's survival had come at an immeasurable cost, not yet counted, and that the bargain she had made with Ethan was no longer separate from her heart. That night in the rain, she had agreed to stay with him for a week in exchange for life. And now that life had been granted, she felt the terrifying pull of wanting to stay. Even after the debt was paid, she looked at him where he stood quietly near the door, eyes shadowed with exhaustion and the reality of what he had done for them, and love rooted itself inside her chest. Alongside fear, she loved him in the way one loves the person who stands beside you when the worst comes true and still does not leave. And the knowledge of that love frightened her more than any contract ever could. Lena first sensed the shift not through words, but through the sudden tightening of the air around Ethan. The morning Victoria Hale stepped back into his life, it began with a call that came just after sunrise, his phone vibrating sharply against the kitchen counter while Lena was quietly preparing soup to bring to Emily. Later that day, she did not intend to listen, yet the sound of a familiar name pulled her attention as surely as a hand closing around her wrist. Victoria, the assistant, said softly, "She says it is urgent," and for the briefest moment, Lena saw something flash through Ethan's eyes. A shadow of memory, perhaps, or a reflex left over from an old life. He took the call in the adjoining room, his voice controlled, but lower than usual, and Lena told herself it meant nothing, that she had no right to feel. The tight ache forming in her chest an hour later. The penthouse elevator chimed, and Victoria Hale walked in, as if she had never left this world of glass and power at all. She was tall, elegant, effortlessly beautiful, in a way that felt deliberate. Every movement precise, every glance perfectly placed. Her perfume filled the room before she spoke, and when she smiled at Ethan, it was with the confidence of a woman who had once belonged to him publicly and expected to again. "Darling," she said as if no years had passed at all. "You look thinner." Lena rose instinctively from her chair, suddenly aware of the difference between them in every possible measure. Victoria's eyes swept over her with calculated curiosity, slow and assessing before she turned back to Ethan. "And who is this, some charitable project?" Lena felt heat rush to her face, humiliation catching her by surprise. Ethan answered firmly, "This is Lena." And when he said her name without explanation, something in Victoria's expression sharpened with interest. "How charming," she said lightly before stepping close to him in a way that invaded the space Lena had grown used to occupying without question. She brushed imaginary lint from his jacket, her hand lingering just a little too long on his chest, and in one fluid movement, she pressed a kiss to his cheek that lingered dangerously close to his mouth. Ethan stiffened, but did not pull away fast enough. The sight landed inside Lena like a quiet, devastating blow. She excused herself without a word, picking up her bag, with hands that trembled too visibly to hide, and walked out before tears could betray her in front of either of them. The city outside felt harsher after the warmth of his world, the noise sharper, the air colder against her cheeks, as rain began again without warning. Soaking her hair and clothes, within seconds she walked, until her lungs burned, not knowing where she was going, only that she could not remain where she felt so suddenly replaceable. Images of Victoria's effortless claim replayed in her mind with cruel clarity, the kiss, the familiarity, the unspoken history between them. The words she had once feared rose like thorns in her chest. You were only a replacement when she returned to the hospital. Emily was sleeping peacefully, unaware of the storm tearing through Lena's heart. She sat beside the bed, holding her sister's hand in silence, as if anchoring herself to the one certainty she still trusted. That night she did not return to the penthouse. Ethan realized what he had lost only when the clock passed midnight and Lena still had not come home. He stood in the living room, staring at the door with a growing sense of wrongness. Swelling in his chest, he replayed the moment Victoria had appeared, the way he had underestimated the effect it would have on Lena, the way he had allowed old habits of control and public appearances to bleed carelessly into something fragile and personal. When he called Lena's phone, it went unanswered, and the sound of his own voice leaving messages into the void unsettled him more than any negotiation he had ever lost. Victoria watched him from the doorway with quiet amusement masked beneath concern. "You did not tell me you were keeping someone here," she said lightly. He turned on her then with an edge in his voice that startled even her. "She is not someone she is everything right now." Victoria's smile faltered for the first time, but she recovered quickly. Offering him a drink, he refused. The night passed in uneasy tension, and at dawn he drove himself to the hospital without waiting for his driver, desperation guiding him faster than caution. Inside the recovery wing, he found Lena asleep in a chair beside Emily, her head resting against the bed, her face pale with exhaustion, and dried tears along her lashes. The sight cut through his defenses with brutal clarity. He stood there for a long moment, unable to wake her, afraid of what he might see in her eyes. When she did wake, when she finally stirred and saw him, she straightened instantly, the distance between them returning like a wall built overnight. "You brought her here," he said softly. She nodded without meeting his gaze. She did not accuse him, did not demand explanation. Her silence carried a heavier weight than anger ever could. "Lena," he began, but she shook her head. "I know what this is," she said quietly. "This was always a contract." I forgot for a moment. His breath caught at the quiet acceptance in her voice, because he realized then that she believed she had been foolish not to expect this ending. That realization struck him harder than any public scandal ever had. He reached for her hand, but she stepped back just enough to avoid his touch. "Don not," she whispered. "Not like that." The rejection was small but devastating in its precision, and for the first time since his wife's death, Ethan felt the sharp, unmistakable pain of losing someone who was still standing right in front of him. That night, after Lena left the hospital without him, he returned alone to the penthouse where Victoria waited with composed patience, and he realized with sudden clarity that she represented a life he no longer wanted, a life of appearances, calculated alliances, and safety without warmth. His voice was steady when he told her she needed to leave, that whatever had once existed between them was over. Victoria studied him for a long moment before letting out a soft, incredulous laugh. "You would choose a poor girl over everything you built." He did not answer because the truth of it was already beating painfully in his chest. When she left, the apartment felt emptier than it ever had before, and he understood at last that jealousy had been the least of what he felt that day. What he truly faced now was the certainty that he had driven away the woman he had begun to love. The storm that followed Lena after she left the hospital did not come from the sky, but from screens and whispers, and the sudden cruelty of strangers who had never seen her face, yet believed they owned her story. It began with a headline that flashed across a news feed before she even reached the bus stop Billionaire Blackwell scene, with young mystery woman, and within minutes the comments multiplied. Like wildfire, greedy for judgment and spectacle, some called her a gold digger, others called her a scam artist, and a few were cruel enough to suggest she had sold herself for surgery money, as if desperation itself were a crime. Lena learned of it not through a reporter, but through a message from an old classmate who sent the link with a single question: "Is this you?" Her hands trembled as she scrolled through the thread. Her name speculated, her face blurred from a long-lens photo, taken outside the hospital the night Emily had been wheeled into surgery. She felt stripped without having been touched, exposed without having been seen for who she really was. By the time she reached Emily's recovery room, the comments had turned vicious pages, speculated on Ethan's past relationships, dragging Victoria's name into the open and weaving a narrative where Lena became nothing more than the cheap stand in between power and reunion. She watched nurses whisper as she passed and felt the unbearable weight of humiliation settle over her shoulders when she locked herself in the bathroom. She pressed her hands to the sink and stared at her reflection, barely recognizing the girl whose eyes looked too old for her age. "I was just a replacement," she whispered to herself, and the words felt like a sentence rather than a thought. She did not answer Ethan's messages that night, or the next morning she muted his calls and turned her phone face down on the small bedside table. While she sat with Emily, listening to the slow, steady rhythm of recovery, her sister stirred occasionally, murmuring in confusion, and Lena forced smiles. She did not feel telling her that everything was fine, even as the world she had briefly stepped into collapsed around her in public view. When Emily finally asked in a weak voice if Ethan had been by Lena, hesitated only a moment before saying he was busy. The lie tasted bitter, but she could not afford the truth yet. Outside the hospital, reporters began to gather cameras flashing whenever anyone who looked remotely like her walked past the doors, and security was tightened to keep them at bay. Lena slipped out through a side exit, wrapped in a borrowed jacket she did not recognize, walking fast with her head down as questions were shouted into the rain behind her. That afternoon, she packed the few belongings she had gathered at the penthouse earlier in the week, which had been returned by a discreet courier without explanation. The sight of her folded clothes in a plain box felt like a final confirmation that she had been temporary even in the smallest details. Across the city, Ethan searched for her with a growing sense of panic that he disguised as control. He called the hospital repeatedly, only to be told she had left hours earlier. He sent his security team to every address he could think of, including the small apartment near Queens she had once mentioned in passing. But it stood dark and empty, her landlord saying she had broken the lease that morning. Without explanation, the absence of her presence invaded every room of the penthouse in ways he could not escape. Her humming at the sink, the sound of her footsteps in the hallway, the quiet way she used to say his name as if it were something fragile. He tried calling again and again until the sound of his own unanswered voice began to feel like an accusation. For the first time in his life, he reached for a bottle, not in celebration or strategy, but in raw helplessness, and he drank alone at the long dining table, where she had once sat across from him with shy, nervous smiles. The media storm intensified with each hour, and Victoria was interviewed twice that day, smiling carefully as she spoke of past connections and mutual respect, without confirming or denying anything specific, letting implication do the work that truth could not. Analysts speculated on mergers and partnerships and the potential fallout of personal scandal bleeding into corporate confidence. Ethan watched the footage in silence, his jaw locked as the image of Lena's face from the hospital camera lingered on the screen behind Victoria's polished profile, and with sudden clarity, he understood that no public correction, no press conference, no carefully crafted statement could undo the damage already done to her dignity. That night he drove through streets he would never normally know, searching not for leverage or advantage, but for a lost girl who had walked into his life through rain and desperate courage. He passed shelters and late-night diners and hospital entrances until exhaustion overtook him, and he returned to the penthouse with nothing but the echo of her absence. Greeting him at the door, he poured another drink and stared out at the city until dawn broke pale and indifferent over the rooftops. Lena had not gone far, but she had gone deep into herself, finding temporary refuge in a small room above a 24-hour laundromat near the river, where the sound of machines and rushing water blurred into a constant white noise she could almost disappear into. She paid in cash and kept the lights low and cried silently into a pillow that smelled of detergent and old summer heat. She told herself she had done what she came to do. Her sister was alive, that was enough, that had to be enough. Yet the ache in her chest did not listen to logic, and the image of Ethan standing in the hospital doorway, with regret in his eyes, returned to her again and again uninvited. She pressed her hands over her ears as if she could muffle memory. On the third day after Emily's surgery, her sister finally woke, long enough to ask where she was, and when Lena did not answer, immediately Emily frowned in confusion. "What happened to him?" she asked softly. The question pierced deeper than any headline ever could. Lena forced a smile and said nothing important, just a misunderstanding, but the word felt thin against the truth that she believed with growing certainty. Love had never been part of the deal, and she had been foolish to imagine otherwise. That night, Ethan sat alone on the edge of his bed, the weight of what he had lost pressing heavily into his chest as the rain returned to the windows, and he realized with painful clarity that power could buy silence and loyalty and access, but it could not buy back the trust he had let slip from his hands, and for the first time in years, he slept not from exhaustion, but from grief. Ethan had not slept more than a few broken hours when the truth began to unravel itself piece by piece, not through headlines or speculation, but through the quiet trail of facts Lena had left behind without knowing she was leaving them for him. To find it began with a call from the hospital billing office. Early that morning, a routine confirmation request that caught his attention only because the administrator sounded confused as she explained that all funds for Emily Carter had been transferred directly from an anonymous account linked to a student aid foundation, not from any personal account belonging to Lena Carter herself. Ethan felt something tighten in his chest and asked for the records to be sent immediately when they arrived. Moments later, he stared at the statements in disbelief. Every single payment, every authorization, every emergency fee had been processed without a cent passing through Lena's hands. She had never touched the money. She had never asked for anything for herself. The image the media had painted collapsed instantly under the weight of that single truth. He made another series of calls, this time to the transplant coordinator, to the nursing supervisor, to the doctor who had met Lena in the hallway that first night after surgery, and each of them confirmed in their own quiet way that the young woman had slept in a chair for 3 nights straight, refusing the offered restroom because she did not want to be away. if her sister woke scared that she had brought her own food to save money, even when she did not need to anymore, that she had thanked everyone who passed her with a humility so instinctive it left an impression, with every word another layer of misunderstanding stripped away, until only the truth remained raw and undeniable. Lena had never used him, and the contract he believed she accepted as survival had in fact become the reason she thought she could never reach for him again. The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow, and he pressed his palm flat against his chest as if he could steady the violent rhythm their love. He finally named it, without hesitation and without retreat. Not desire, not protection, not loneliness, but love, sharp and unyielding in its clarity. He loved her, and he had let her walk away, believing she had been nothing more than a substitute. He left the penthouse without a word to anyone and drove aimlessly, at first guided only by memory and instinct, tracing the edges of the city she had once described in passing so long ago, when she spoke of night shifts and subway rides and a view of water that made her feel less alone. He crossed bridges and narrow streets until at last he found himself beneath the shadows of old brick buildings, near the river where the city felt quieter and more tired and real. It was a clerk at a 24-hour laundromat who finally recognized her description. Thin, dark-hair eyes that looked like they were always searching for something, and pointed upward toward a small stairwell without asking questions. Ethan took the steps 2 at a time and knocked on the only door with a faint light beneath it. When Lena opened the door just enough to see his face, her breath caught and she tried to close it again, but his hand stopped it gently, not in force but in plea. "Please," he said softly, and hearing the rawness in his own voice startled him as much as it did her. She hesitated for a heart-wrenching second before stepping aside in silence. The room was barely larger than a closet, a narrow bed, a single chair, a small window, streaked with rain and exhaustion. He took it in with a quiet pain because this was the world she had returned to without complaint, without asking him for anything. He turned to her and spoke the truth without defenses or negotiation. "I was wrong," he said simply, and the weight of the admission settled heavily between them. "I let myself believe the lies because they were easier than the fear of caring. I believed you were using me because I did not want to face how much I needed you." Lena stared at him, her eyes shining but guarded her arms folded tightly across her chest, as if to hold herself together. "You do not get to say this now," she whispered after a moment. "I did not take your money for me, Ethan. I stayed because you asked me to. I left because I thought you had already replaced me." The words landed exactly where they were meant to, and he did not flinch from them. "You were never a replacement," he said, his voice breaking on the truth. "You were the first person who made me remember why I stayed alive after my wife died. I just didn't realize it until I lost you." The silence that followed felt endless, broken only by the distant hiss of the river and the hum of the laundromat below. Lena looked away, first blinking rapidly to contain the emotion her body had already betrayed. "You hurt me," she said quietly, and he nodded because denial would have been another cruelty. "I know, and I will spend the rest of my life proving I am not that man again. If you let me, not because of a contract, not because of a debt, but because I love you." The word hung between them, a fragile bridge and a terrifying promise. She laughed softly through tears, a sound that carried both relief and disbelief. "You say that like it fixes everything," she murmured, and he shook his head slowly. "It does not, but it changes everything." She did not answer immediately, and he did not rush her. For the first time, he allowed silence to exist without trying to control it. He waited while she sat on the edge of the bed, her shoulders shaking, with the effort of holding herself steady. And when she finally looked at him again, the wall in her eyes had cracked just enough to let something through. "I do not know if I can forgive you yet," she said, "but I know I still love you too, and that is what scares me the most." The confession loosened something inside him. So suddenly he had to steady himself against the back of the chair. "Then let me be afraid with you," he said softly. She nodded once, and for the first time since the hospital hallway, she stepped into his arms of her own choosing. The embrace was not desperate, but it was real, and it trembled with everything they had not been able to say until now. When they parted, she rested her forehead against his chest and exhaled a quiet, unsteady breath. "Emily is still weak," she said, and he answered without hesitation. "Then I will wait as long as it takes because I am not leaving again." Outside, the rain returned to the streets, washing the city in silver and shadow, as if even the storm were turning the page on what had come before. And for the first time since that night in the penthouse, when fate had written its contract in silence, they stood together not because they had bargained for survival, but because they had chosen each other, knowing with equal clarity that the road ahead would not be gentle, and that love once named could no longer pretend to be anything else. The warning came not with sirens or shouting, but with a single trembling voicemail that Lena discovered on her phone just after midnight, as she sat beside Emily's bed, listening to the soft cadence of the heart monitor that had become the rhythm of her life. At first, she thought it was another missed call from an unknown reporter or a stranger hungry for scandal. But when she played it back, she heard her own voice screaming, her sister's name in her memory, and then a man's voice, low and deliberate, telling her that Emily was no longer where she believed she was, and that panic surged through her so violently she nearly dropped the phone. She stood so fast the chair clattered backward, and Ethan was instantly at her side, his body responding before his mind could frame the danger she tried to speak, but no words came, only the sound of her breathing breaking apart. Finally, she forced the truth past her lips. "They took her. Emily is gone," for one frozen heartbeat. The hallway felt unreal, as if the world had tilted sideways and forgotten how to right itself. Then Ethan moved with sudden lethal focus, calling his security team. Before Lena could even gather her coat, the hospital staff rushed in, voices overlapping in confusion and alarm, as the empty bed confirmed what the message had promised. Emily had vanished between shift changes, between cameras, between a moment of vulnerability wide enough for the wrong hands to reach through. The message played again on speaker, this time for Ethan and his team, and the demand came through with brutal clarity. A figure that made Lena's stomach twist because it was not designed to be paid, but to control the voice, named the debt her family had never truly escaped, the loans her parents had taken years ago to keep the house and the quiet interest that had grown into something monstrous long after the lenders were supposed to be gone. Lena felt the truth slam into her chest with a clarity she had tried to outrun. "We owe them," she whispered, and the shame in her voice burned deeper than fear. Ethan looked at her sharply and caught her by the shoulders. "You owe no one," he said, and meant it, with a ferocity that made her breath hitch. Within minutes, the penthouse became a command center of movement and quiet orders screens, lit with satellite maps and street cameras as his security, traced every possible route from the hospital garage to the river roads beyond it. Lena stood in the center of the storm, feeling useless and terrified, and certain that this was her fault, that every step she had taken into Ethan's world had pulled Shadow closer to her sister when she tried to insist on going alone. Ethan cut her off with a look that brooked no argument. "You are not facing this without me," he said, and the certainty in his voice anchored her to reality just enough to keep her from breaking apart. They moved through the city at a speed she had never known, weaving through traffic under flashing lights that did not belong to the police, but to the power money could summon, without question. Every second stretched thin as wire, as the team closed in on a warehouse near the docks where the signal from the kidnapper's phone had been traced. Rain fell again, heavy and merciless, turning the asphalt slick and dangerous beneath their tires, and Lena pressed her hands together in her lap, whispering Emily's name like a prayer she had never learned to believe in. At the edge of the docks, the vehicles slowed and lights cut as the team moved on foot, their steps muffled by the storm, and the roar of the river beyond the warehouse loomed as a dark mass against the water, its windows blind, its doors locked. When a single light flickered inside, Lena felt her heart lurch violently. "She is in there," she breathed, and Ethan squeezed her hand, once before stepping forward, instructing her to stay, with 2 guards at the perimeter. The seconds that followed stretched into an unbearable eternity of muffled sound and sharp shadows moving against rusted metal. Her breath came in shallow bursts as she imagined every terrible possibility crowding into her mind at once. The door finally burst inward with a sound that cracked through the rain, and voices rose in sudden chaos, shouting commands, footsteps scattering. Lena fought the hands that tried to hold her back, panic lending her strength she did not recognize, until Ethan appeared again at the threshold, soaked and urgent, his eyes searching until they found her. "Stay here," he commanded, but she had already pushed past him, running through the dark toward the interior where a single bulb cast a harsh circle of light on concrete. Emily lay at the center of that light, bound to a chair, her face pale, her breathing shallow but real, and the sight of her alive shattered whatever restraint Lena had left. She dropped to her knees in front of her sister, tears breaking free. As she fumbled at the restraints with shaking hands, Emily's eyes fluttered open in confusion and fear before recognition warmed them faintly. "Lena," she whispered weakly, and the sound of her voice felt like a miracle. Behind them, Ethan confronted the final man, left standing the one who had made the call, the one who believed money granted him the right to own lives. Their exchange was brief and violent words, giving way to decisive action. Until the threat collapsed into silence, the team moved in as sirens joined the soundscape, at last calling the authorities who would arrive after the danger was already past. Ethan returned to Lena and Emily, kneeling beside them as the last restraint fell away and Lena gathered her sister into her arms, despite the IV lines still threading through her veins. "She is safe now," Ethan said softly, and only then did Lena realize she had been holding her breath, almost from the moment the voicemail began. The ride back to the hospital passed in exhausted silence, broken only by Emily's faint murmurs and the steady reassurances Lena whispered into her hair. When they arrived, the staff moved with practiced speed, returning Emily to monitored care as if the night had been only another crisis in the relentless rhythm of survival. At dawn, when the adrenaline finally ebbed, Lena found herself standing alone in a quiet corridor, staring at the marks on her own hands where the restraints had scraped. As she tore her sister free, she felt hollowed out and heavy and suddenly unable to hold anything more. Ethan found her there as the morning light crept through tall windows, painting the floor in pale gold. He did not speak. At first, he simply stood close enough that she could feel his warmth anchor her trembling. She turned to him, then emotion breaking through exhaustion and fear and relief in one uncontrollable flood. "I brought this to her life," she said in a hoarse whisper. "All of it, the debt, the danger, the media, the men who took her. I should never have come into your world." He caught her face carefully between his hands, forcing her to meet his eyes. "You did not bring the danger," he said. "You brought the truth into mine. And if they came for her, it was because they thought they could reach me through you. That ends now." The weight of his promise settled over her like a shield, and for the first time since the night began, she believed they might survive what had been set in motion. Yet even as calm returned in fragile pieces, the world beyond the hospital walls was already shifting. In darker ways, news of the violent confrontation raced through private channels, tying the incident to Ethan's name and his company, through insinuation and leaked footage that security could not fully contain. Investors began to question alliances, regulators whispered about investigations, and the same media that had devoured Lena now sharpened its teeth for him. He felt the tremor of it in the vibrating phone in his pocket, as his board demanded answers and distance. At once he looked at Lena, standing beside Emily's bed, her hand wrapped gently in her sister's, and understood with sudden clarity that the true price of saving her family had not yet arrived. By the time the sun rose fully over the river, the storm had passed, but its aftermath stretched in every direction, invisible and relentless. Lena leaned her head against Ethan's shoulder for one brief, unguarded moment of quiet, and he rested his cheek against her hair, knowing that the danger was not over. It had only changed its shape, and in the fragile calm that followed, they both felt the same unspoken truth, tightening in their chests, that what came next would demand more than money, more than power, and perhaps more than either of them had left to give. The fallout arrived with ruthless speed, as if the city itself had been waiting for the smallest crack to widen into a collapse, and Ethan felt it the moment his phone began vibrating, without pause, on the edge of the hospital bed where Lena sat watching. Emily breathed the board, wanted an emergency meeting. Regulators wanted statements, investors wanted distance, and the media wanted blood. He took the call outside into the corridor, where the early morning light felt too innocent for the words being spoken into his ear. "They are freezing negotiations. Your stock is already dropping, and the footage from the warehouse is circulating through private channels." His chief counsel warned him with brutal precision. "They are tying the kidnapping to internal financial disputes and possible misconduct. If you do not separate yourself from this situation immediately, they will destroy the company to protect themselves." Ethan closed his eyes, listening to the rain return faintly against the high windows and understood with chilling clarity that every system he had built to protect his empire was now turning inward to save itself without him. He returned to the room quietly, and Lena looked up at him with eyes that still carried the residue of terror and exhaustion. "Is she going to be okay?" she asked softly, gesturing to Emily. He nodded and forced a small smile. "She is stable, good news for now." Lena let out the breath she had been holding for hours and leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples. "I do not know how much longer I can hold it together," she whispered. He crossed the room without thinking and knelt before her. Taking her hands in his, "You do not have to be strong right now," he said. And for one brief, fragile moment, she closed her eyes and allowed herself to lean into the promise of his presence. The illusion shattered minutes later when security arrived with tense urgency in their movements. One of the analysts pulled him aside and spoke in rapid, low tones about warrants and internal leaks and a hostile motion from major shareholders demanding his immediate resignation as chief executive to contain the scandal. They frame it as necessary for public trust. He was told. Ethan listened without interrupting his face, a mask of stillness as every sentence stripped another layer of his former life away. When the words ended, he nodded once in acknowledgement and returned to Lena with a quiet resolve settled behind his eyes that she did not yet recognize as farewell. They moved out of the hospital under heavy guard reporters, shouting questions that echoed like accusations across the pavement and flashes of cameras slicing through the gray morning air. Lena kept her head down, gripping Ethan's hand as if he were the only real thing left in the world, and he held on tightly as if imprinting the moment in memory, because some part of him already knew this was the last time they would walk through that storm as equals. At the penthouse, his board gathered in cold, formal lines. Along the long table, the city spread beneath them in glittering indifference as millions of dollars fluctuated on screens. Behind glass accusations were laid out in precise language, strategic language designed to isolate him from liability while using his name as both shield and sacrifice. Ethan listened until the words ran dry, then rose from his seat without permission, drawing every eye to him at once. "The company will survive without me," he said evenly, "but she will not survive without protection, and I will not allow my life to be measured in profit, while the woman I love is made collateral." The room fell into stunned silence at the word love, spoken with such deliberate weight. He slid a signed document across the table with a steady hand. "My resignation effective immediately release. Every file, every record, every leverage point you have, hidden, and let the investigation run its course without interference. If you attempt to bury this under acceptable loss, I will make certain the truth burns through every firewall you built." The vote passed in stunned urgency, and the gavel fell on a decision that reshaped an empire in a single breath. By the time he left that room, his access was already shrinking, disappearing from screens that once bowed to his touch. The news broke within the hour, headlines flaring across networks as analysts speculated on power struggles and moral crises without understanding the quiet simplicity of the choice beneath it all. When Ethan returned to Lena, the city was already calling him a fallen king and a reckless romantic and everything in between. Yet none of it mattered when he found her seated on the edge of the bed, staring at the headlines on her phone with widening shock. You lost everything, she whispered as he approached her, the words trembling with disbelief and fear. He knelt before her again and lifted her hands to his chest, letting her feel the steady beat of his heart, as if it were proof of what still remained. I chose you, he said simply, and the truth of it settled into the space between them with a weight that stole her breath. She shook her head, tears spilling over. I never asked you to do this. I never wanted you to give up your life for mine. He answered without hesitation. You did not take it from me. I gave it because it is the first thing that has ever felt like my own. She sobbed, then the sound breaking free of her chest in helpless waves as she pressed her forehead against his shoulder and felt the magnitude of the sacrifice crash over her in delayed shock. I only wanted to save my sister, she cried. I never meant to destroy your world. He wrapped his arms around her with a strength that was not desperate but unwavering. My world was already broken, he murmured. You only showed me what it was missing. The hours that followed dissolved into a blur of consequences and quiet moments stolen between sirens and phone calls and lawyers moving through the penthouse. Like ghosts of authority, by evening his accounts were frozen, his name removed from internal systems and his future reduced to questions no longer answerable by money alone. Yet when he stood with Lena beside Emily's bed that night, watching the gentle rise and fall of a life he had helped save, he felt a peace that frightened him in its simplicity. Still, the weight of what he had lost returned in the small hours when Lena finally slept, curled beside Emily's bedside, and he stood alone at the window, staring out at a city that no longer belonged to him in any official way. Doubt coiled quietly in his chest, whispering of lawsuits and ruin and public disgrace, and the harsh road that awaited them both. But beneath it all, another truth burned brighter than fear, that he would make the same choice again, without hesitation, even knowing how far the fall would be. When dawn arrived, Lena stirred and found him still standing. Watch over them. The weariness in his eyes softened when he met her gaze. Come here, he said quietly, and she rose to him without thinking, crossing the few steps between them to rest her head against his chest. She did not speak, she only listened to his heartbeat, grounding herself in the man he had chosen to become, rather than the power he had chosen to surrender. Somewhere in the city, beyond glass and shadow, the empire he had built continued to tremble and buckle under forces already set into motion. But in that fragile moment of morning light, neither of them looked away from what mattered most, and the choice he had made settled into history lesson and prophecy alike. That love would demand everything and leave behind only what was true. The truth reached Lena, not in a single revelation, but in a slow, relentless wave that followed her wherever she turned, as headlines continued to unfold across every screen, and whispered conversations stopped when she entered a room. At first, she tried not to look. She told herself that what mattered now was Emily's recovery, the steady strengthening of her sister's pulse, the warmth returning to her hands, the quiet miracle of survival that still felt unreal when she touched it. Yet the world refused to let the past remain behind them, and each piece of news carved another line of understanding into her heart. She learned that Ethan's resignation had not been temporary, that the board had moved swiftly to sever every remaining tie that could draw regulatory fire back toward the company, and that his name had already been replaced on official documents as if he were a ghost being erased while still standing in the room. She learned that his accounts had been frozen tighter than he had ever admitted, and that assets once measured in continents were now bound in litigation and uncertainty. And she learned all of this not from him, but from her phone, from strangers, from messages sent by people she had never met and would never want to. The realization crushed her slowly and completely. As she sat beside Emily's bed, watching the woman she loved most in the world recover because of a sacrifice she had never asked for and never understood in its full magnitude until now. When she confronted Ethan, it was not with shouting or accusation, but with quiet devastation that left him more shaken than anger ever could. "You lost your company," she said softly that evening as they stood together on the hospital balcony, the city glowing faintly below them in exhausted light. "You lost your money, your power, everything you built." He did not deny it. He simply nodded once, and the simplicity of the gesture nearly broke her all because of me. The words fell between them, heavy and absolute, and for the first time he saw guilt eclipse love in her eyes. He reached for her hands, but she pulled back, not in rejection, but in fear that touching him might recognize a debt she could never repay. "I never agreed to this," she whispered, her voice trembling with understanding and pain. "I did not agree for you to give up your life for mine," he answered with the same calm certainty that had guided every decisive moment of the last days. "You agreed to stay with me for a week, and somewhere between the rain and the waiting rooms, I chose to give you everything else because it belonged to you more than it ever belonged to me." She shook her head fiercely, tears spilling over as the truth of it overwhelmed her. "I only wanted to save my sister," she cried. "I never wanted you to become a story of ruin for the world to watch." He drew her into his arms, this time before she could retreat, and held her with a tenderness stripped of pride or possession. "Then let me be ruined," he said into her hair, "because I have never been more alive than I am right now." She clutched his shirt with desperate trembling fingers, and the sound that broke from her was not only grief, but awe at the depth of what he had done, without ever asking to be praised for it. The days that followed were shaped by quiet reckoning as lawyers moved through the hospital corridors, and security thinned to a single line between them, and a world that now treated Ethan as both scandal and sacrifice. Emily was strong enough to speak, again asking careful questions in a voice still fragile, and when she learned fragments of the truth, her eyes filled with tears that mirrored Lena's pain. "You saved me twice," she whispered once to Ethan when Lena was away, "speaking to a doctor once with your money, and once with everything else." He answered gently that he had only done what anyone would do if they loved her family enough, and she smiled faintly because she sensed the truth behind the words. That evening Lena returned alone to the penthouse, for the first time since she had fled it in shame and misunderstanding, and now she walked its halls with a heart newly awakened to what it had cost him. To leave this place behind, the walls were still adorned with art worth more than entire neighborhoods, and the silence felt heavier than it ever had. When Power lived here in the bedroom, his wardrobe stood half empty, his clothes already packed for a life that no longer fit inside these rooms, and the sight struck her with a force she could barely endure. She sank onto the edge of the bed and pressed her hands to her mouth as the truth reached its sharpest clarity. He had not only given up an empire, he had given up every certainty that had once held him upright. When she returned to the hospital that night, she went to him without hesitation, finding him alone in a quiet waiting area staring at the darkened city through tall windows. I ran, before she said softly, and he turned toward her with surprise, flickering briefly across his weary features. I ran from you when I should have trusted you, and now I see what it cost you for me to come back. She stepped into his arms this time without doubt or retreat, and held him with a strength born from finally understanding the weight of his choice. I am afraid, she whispered into his chest, and he kissed the top of her head as if grounding them both. I am afraid too, he answered, but we will be afraid together. In that shared confession, something shifted at last from imbalance to truth, as they stood no longer as benefactor and beneficiary, nor as power and vulnerability, but as two people stripped down to what they were willing to lose for one another. She lifted her face to his, and for the first time since the beginning, she initiated the kiss, not in desperation or confusion, but in certainty, the kind that settles after every illusion has burned away. His hands trembled as they framed her face, returning the kiss with careful reverence, as if loving her now meant something entirely new, something earned through sacrifice rather than desire alone. When they parted, she rested her forehead against his and smiled through tears. We will build something small. She said something real, something that nobody can take from us. He smiled faintly back at her and nodded, because for the first time in his life, he believed that what remained in his hands was enough. The night was quiet in the way only hospitals could be. After crisis had passed, the corridors dimmed, the sounds softened into distant murmurs and steady machine rhythms. Lena sat beside Emily, watching her sleep more peacefully than she had in weeks, and for the first time since everything had shattered around them. The air did not feel heavy with fear when she stepped out into the hallway. She found Ethan waiting near the window, where the city lights stretched like a scattered constellation beneath the dark sky. He turned at the sound of her footsteps, and for a moment neither of them spoke, because words felt too small for what they carried inside them now. He looked different to her, not because his suit was gone, or because the sharp edge of power no longer surrounded him, but because the man who stood before her was unguarded in a way she had never seen before, stripped of titles, stripped of strategy, stripped of all defenses except the simple truth in his eyes. I was thinking, he said quietly, about how we began with signatures and silence and fear. She nodded slowly, remembering the rain, the penthouse, the deal that had changed everything, without either of them understanding how deeply it would cut. I remember, she answered, and felt her chest tighten with the echo. Of that night we were both desperate in different ways. He took a breath as if steadying himself, then reached into the pocket of his coat and withdrew a small worn envelope. I found this yesterday, he said, holding it out to her. It was in the drawer where my wife kept letters she was afraid to throw away. Lena hesitated before taking it. Sensing the weight of what it might contain, inside was a folded piece of paper, yellowed with time. A simple handwritten note that carried a sincerity untouched by ambition. The words were Emily's, written years ago. After the algorithm crisis had nearly destroyed his life and his company, when she had stepped forward to correct what no one else would, she read it, with trembling hands as her sister's quiet courage unfolded in ink and gratitude and belief in a man she had never known in this light. When she finished, she looked up at him with tears in her eyes and saw that he was watching her, not for reaction, but for understanding. "She believed in you," he said softly, "and I think somewhere in that belief, I began waiting for the day someone would look at me the way she looked at who I could be, not who I was allowed to be in public." His voice faltered only slightly, and she felt the ache of that truth inside her own heart. "You never had to become anything for me," she whispered. "You were already enough that when you did not see it." He took her hands in his, then slowly lowered himself to one knee on the quiet hospital floor, and the movement startled her so badly she almost pulled back in reflex. "Ethan, what are you doing?" she asked, her voice breaking with emotion and disbelief. He looked up at her with steadiness that had nothing to do with wealth or authority and everything to do with choice. For the first time, he said, "There is no contract between us, no deal, no debt, no rescue. To be negotiated, there is only what I feel and what I choose. Lena, I love you, not because you needed saving, not because you reminded me of loss, but because you stood in the storm and did not run from who I was becoming. I love you because you made me remember that survival is not the same as living." Her knees trembled as tears flooded her vision, and she covered her mouth with one hand, unable to stop the rush of feeling that overwhelmed her chest. "Ethan," she whispered, "you have already given too much. You have lost too much for me." He shook his head gently, no longer the man who measured everything in gain and loss. "I lost what I built when it became a place where love could not follow me anymore. I am not asking you to replace what I was. I am asking you to walk with who I am now." He reached up and took her trembling hand in his steady one. "This time, I want you without any deal, without fear, without conditions. Just as you are," he said, and the words settled into her soul with a finality that felt both terrifying and free. For a moment, the world held its breath around them, then she laughed through her tears, a soft, broken sound of wonder and relief, and she dropped to her knees before him, not as an equal in power, but as an equal in truth. "I was so afraid," she admitted, "that loving you would mean losing myself again, that I would always be standing in the shadow of what you gave up." He lifted her face gently until their eyes met and answered with unwavering clarity, "You are not my shadow. You are my direction." She fell into his arms then, and the embrace was not desperate, but whole, a joining without fear or distance or illusion. And they stayed that way for a long, quiet moment, while the world beyond glass and brick continued to turn unaware that something irrevocable had been named at last. When they rose, he pressed his forehead to hers and smiled faintly for the first time, without any trace of caution. "Wherever we go from here," he said, "we go as ourselves." And she nodded, because for the first time she believed that survival was no longer the goal living was. 2 years passed, the way healing often does, quietly, unevenly, and with more courage than spectacle. And when spring returned to the city, it did not arrive with headlines or scandal, but with soft light spilling over the river, where Lena now walked every morning before her hospital shift began. She had finished nursing school in a blur of night classes and late study sessions, and the kind of determination that came from knowing exactly what it meant to fight for a life. Emily walked beside her now, slower than before, but smiling with a strength that felt hard-won and luminous in its certainty. the scar at her chest had faded to a pale, thin line, and she often touched it without thinking, as if acknowledging the past and choosing the future in the same breath. Across the water, a small medical foundation building stood modest and bright, its glass windows catching the early sun with a promise that felt gentle rather than grand. It did not bear Ethan Blackwell's name anywhere, only a simple plaque that read, Hope Clinic Community Care. And the first time Lena had seen it, she understood what he meant when he said power could be rebuilt in quieter ways. Inside the clinic, where he now volunteered and managed what little he still owned, the walls were lined with photographs of people whose lives had bent away from loss and towards something like possibility. Some of them were children, others were grandparents, and none of them knew the man who greeted them every day with coffee and steady kindness had once commanded an empire that trembled at his decisions. He belonged to this place now not as a figure of authority, but as part of a living, breathing effort, where no one stood above another, and when Lena arrived after her shift, she often found him sitting beside a patient bed, listening without hurry, the way he had once listened to her in the darkest hours before anyone demanded proof that he could still be something more than what he had lost. Their home was no longer a penthouse with walls of glass, but a small house near the river filled with second-hand furniture, mismatched mugs, and the sound of laughter that felt entirely their own. The first year had been the hardest as they learned how to stand in a world that did not bow to their name or their history, and where every step forward had to be earned rather than demanded. There were days when money felt tight, when fear returned, when the weight of all that had been surrendered brushed too close to the surface, and they had to remind each other that what they chose to keep was greater than what they had released. Emily moved in with them at the end of that first year, her strength returning slowly, alongside a sense of independence she had not known for too long. She found work in data analysis at a local research center, and in quiet ways, she watched over them both with the same steady intelligence that had once saved an empire without ever needing credit. Sometimes at night, when the house was quiet, she would sit on the porch steps with Lena and talk about the strange shape of destiny, the way one small choice could ripple into lives no one could have predicted, and they would laugh softly at the madness of it all, while the river whispered beside them. On an early summer evening, as the sky blushed gold and pink with the promise of lingering light, Ethan drove them out toward the coast without saying much, only that he wanted to show them something. Lena watched the horizon open wide before them and felt a familiar tightening in her chest, the kind that came with anticipation and memory. Braided together, they reached the shore as the tide pulled gently at the sand and the air carried the scent of salt and renewal. Emily lingered near the edge, smiling quietly, as if she already understood what was about to unfold. Ethan led Lena toward the water, where the waves lapped at their ankles, and for a moment they stood together, watching the sun sink low enough to scatter fire across the surface. She thought of the night in the rain, the penthouse, the deal that had brought her here, and felt the full arc of their story settle into her heart, with a tenderness that nearly stole her breath when he turned to face her. His eyes held no trace of hesitation, only certainty made gentle by time. "I never wanted to be the man who needed saving," he said softly, "but I became the man who needed you, and that changed everything." she smiled through the sudden shimmer of tears and answered that they had saved each other in ways neither of them would ever fully measure. He reached into his pocket and drew out a simple ring, not ornate, not dramatic, just a quiet circle of promise, and held it between them with hands steadier than they had ever been when fate first tested his resolve. "Lena Carter," he said, and the sound of her name carried more meaning than any vow could. "Will you choose me, not as a replacement, not as a rescue, but as the man I am allowed to be beside you every day?" Her laughter broke free in a soft, trembling expression of joy and release, and she placed her hands against his chest, just above the heart that had learned to live again. "Yes," she answered without pause. "I choose you," and the waves seemed to echo the word as he slipped the ring onto her finger with a reverence that transformed the small gesture into something sacred. Emily clapped from the shoreline, wiping tears from her cheeks without shame as they embraced, and for a moment the world felt perfectly aligned, as if every loss, every storm, every breaking had been leading them to this simple truth. They were married that autumn in a quiet ceremony by the river, attended by patients from the clinic nurses who had stood beside them in the worst nights, and neighbors who had become family through shared kindness rather than shared history. There were no gowns of silk, no fireworks of wealth, only warm lights, soft music, and hands, joined in gratitude for what had survived. When Lena walked toward Ethan beneath strings of lanterns, he saw not the girl who had once stepped into his world as a substitute, but the woman who had taught him how to remain when walking away would have been easier. Years later, when life had grown into a mosaic of ordinary miracles shifts at the clinic family dinners, evenings spent watching the river glow beneath moonlight, they would sometimes speak of the contract fate had written for them that first night, and they would smile at how far it had transformed into a promise freely given and freely kept. And when questions arose about how the girl who once came in her sister place had become the woman of his life, Lena would answer simply that love had never been part of the deal, and yet it had become everything. If this story touched your heart in any way, if even one moment made you pause, breathe deeper, or remember the kind of love that changes a life, then you are exactly the kind of listener this channel is made for. And right now, I want to hear from you. Tell me where you are watching, from what city, what state, what corner of the world. Did this story reach you from? Because every place matters, and every listener becomes part of this growing family of stories. Also tell me, honestly, did you believe in Ethan and Lena? Did their love feel real to you? Did the ending give you hope or leave you with longing? I read your comments every day, and your words shape the stories I create next. If you felt connected to this journey, please tap the like button, because it tells the algorithm this story deserves to be shared with someone else who might need it tonight. And if you have not subscribed yet, this is your invitation to join us here, where every story is built on deep emotion, difficult choices, and love that grows through pain. Tomorrow, another story is coming, one that begins with a stranger at a hospital door and a secret that will change everything. And I truly do not want you to miss it. Subscribe now and turn on the notification so the story finds you the moment it goes live. And if you know someone who loves emotional romance, billionaire transformation, second chances, or quiet, powerful love, share this story with them. Send it to a friend, a sister, a partner, or even to yourself for later. because sometimes the right story finds us exactly when we need it most. And before you go, I have one final question for you. If you were in Lena's place, would you have made the same choice that night in the rain? Would you have walked into the unknown for someone you loved? Leave your answer in the comments, and I promise I will read it and thank you for staying with me until the final moment of this story. Your time, your heart, and your attention mean more than you know.